Hello, everyone. Mr. Lopez here with a quick brainstorming exercise related to our essay number one, our first major essay of the semester. We'll have three major essays and then our final exam this summer. And so I usually try to make one of these brainstorming videos for each major assignment. So you get used to seeing these. So essay number one, the way to approach it is just as you would approach any compare-contrast paper. And the two entities I'm asking you to compare and contrast are two types of salvation. Earthly salvation compared with spiritual salvation. And so what you're going to do is, I think, start with the most fundamental definition of being saved. So salvation simply means to be saved. And I think what you probably want to do is understand that salvation requires two things: a threat and a savior. So something to be saved from, the threat, and something to do the saving, and that would be the savior. So fundamental definition of salvation, no reason to overthink it. And then throughout your paper, you're going to run a compare-contrast between the two types. So earthly salvation, what I mean by that is of the earth. In other words, not spiritual, so not supernatural. I'll give you some examples. Some examples of earthly threats include things like a house fire, a rip current that would pull you out and threaten to drown you when you're at the beach, a hurricane, other things that are more personal, addiction, depression, even colds, a virus like COVID. So these are things of the earth. They can be studied and proven, and they threaten your existence. They threaten to harm you. Examples of earthly saviors would be things that counteract those earthly threats that can be experienced, seen, proven, sensed with all your five senses, such as first responders, EMTs, police officers, friends, family, of course, nurses and physicians, and then medications and other ways to sort of protect our earthly bodies and our earthly experiences from threats, like a mask or a vaccine in the case of COVID. So these are all earthly threats, earthly saviors, so they belong under the category of earthly salvation. Comparatively, the other side would be something spiritual. So spiritual salvation involves supernatural entities. Very often, and you might argue in your paper that always, spiritual salvation requires some degree of faith, some degree of belief without needing proof. For example, spiritual threats would include things like eternal punishment or eternal damnation, the devil, hell, demons. Things that even if you're not a spiritual person, you know, things that threaten the spiritual side of lives. If there is a spiritual person, such as we're reading Langston Hughes' Salvation, his essay Salvation, all of the elders who were at the revival are praying to be saved from eternal punishment. They want their Judeo-Christian God, Jesus, to intercede on their behalf to protect them from supernatural threats, spiritual threats like eternal punishment. That's one example. Supernatural saviors, again, typically will require some degree of faith, as opposed to the physician or the nurse who will walk into your hospital room and administer medication and treatment. Supernatural saviors quite often are things like some higher power, some deity, angels, or just the act of prayer. So what you're doing for this essay is we're reading three different pieces in those first couple weeks of the semester. We're reading Langston Hughes, Barmania and Rice, and Hudson, and the Matthew Hudson piece. And these all deal with ways to consider belief and faith and prayer and how those sort of interact or counteract or sort of clash with threats, earthly threats and spiritual threats. And so when you are going to set up your compare contrast of these two different types of salvation, some questions you might consider that I think would give you a sort of a more complex answer to the prompt, a more complex compare contrast. Can a spiritual threat ever be overcome by an earthly savior? In other words, can something like the threat of hell or eternal damnation that the elders in Hughes's essay are praying to be saved from, can they ever be countered by something earthly, like a medication or a physician or a nurse or a first responder? And what might that look like? Conversely, you might consider the question here: can an earthly threat ever be overcome by a spiritual savior? And this is where you might consider an example such as this. Very often, when a person who is of a spiritual bent, or at least has been exposed to spirituality in their life, when they're in a dire situation, they're trapped in a situation where there's a physical threat of violence, or they get in a very, very bad car accident, for example, what they do often is pray. They will say, please, please, God, save me from the active shooter. Please, God, save me from my car having flipped over and potentially catching on fire. They don't say always, please, EMT, get here fast. Please, first responders, get here fast. They might say that, but quite often they will ask for a higher power, a spiritual savior, to intercede on their behalf in an instance of earthly threat. So why? You might consider in your paper. Why do people do that? And if you consider our readings, the Hudson and Bermenia Rice pieces, you'll get that their ideas on why people do those kinds of things. A brief pause. Make sure you read the essay number 1 prompt completely, including the guidelines that are on the second page. In the third page, what we're not doing is we're not using our readings for this essay within the paper itself. So you will not quote from Hughes, Bormanian, Rice, and Hudson anywhere in your essay. You will not do any research for this paper. You will not have a works cited page. Everything within this first essay will be your own individual claims and examples, things that you create yourself. The reason why we're going to read the readings and do some weekly exercises with the readings is just to generate our own thoughts and to help us sort of approach this essay from a critical thinking perspective. There's no right, wrong, or easy answer for how spiritual and earthly salvation compare. So you're going to want to consider things like, very basic, what are the similarities and differences between the two types of threats? How do, again, earthly threats like house fires, depression, addiction compare to spiritual threats, eternal punishment, the devil, hell, demons? How are they different? And same thing for saviors. How are the two types of saviors, earthly and spiritual, similar and different? And so what I would expect is that by the time you use your own arguments to say how these two things are different, how are they similar, how are the threats and saviors similar and different in each case, and you explore some examples, you should be at the full 3 pages that are required for the essay. Quite often people will write a paper that's 4 or 5 pages, and that's completely fine. What I care about is the minimum. So the minimum page requirement is 3 full pages. So down to the very, very bottom of page 3, if not spilling onto page 4. All of the ideas and examples, again, will be yours from your own brain, your own ideas, your own arguments. We will not be quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing any other readings for class, anything you do your own research on. None of that can make its way into the paper. This is all you. We will get to class readings and integrating research material with our next 2 papers. Again, so just a quick brainstorming. This is how I would approach the essay from a very basic definition of salvation to the two types, earthly and spiritual, and I would break them down into threats and saviors. I would consider their similarities and differences, and I would consider, can they ever overlap? Can spiritual threats be overcome by earthly saviors? And on the other side, can earthly threats ever be overcome by spiritual saviors? Have fun with this, y'all. I know it's not a super easy essay prompt, like what's your favorite color or your favorite kind of car or your favorite song. But these are the types of questions I ask to sort of get your creative and critical thinking sides, your juices going. If I can help, as always, just let me know. Email me. I'm happy to help. Of course, as I always tell my students, I cannot grade your paper before it's due. But if you have specific questions, I'm more than happy to help you, especially if you're stuck. Good luck, and I will be in touch.